All right, everybody, welcome to week 3. We're really getting into some of the deep course content at this point, so this is a great week to make sure you're practicing good note-taking skills during the lecture. I'm not going to go over all of the readings as a general rule in this class and in these lectures, but I will frequently hit on some high points especially when I expect you to really hit those high points hard on your discussion post for the week, and this is one of those weeks. We're also really moving towards the big part 1 project for this class, which is due in just a couple weeks. I believe week 5 is when the part 1 project is due. We're going to spend some time today with me speaking about what I'm really looking for there, what we mean by social identity, and we'll sort of unpack that a little bit more. So let's jump in. All right, like I said, social identity. I want to get us thinking about what is it. And I had mentioned before that we can think of culture on 3 levels that program us all up. And we could actually add a 4th level that's just humanity. We could think of the things that all humans do. We all have to eat, generally speaking. We all have to move. We all have to consume water. We all consume air. We all communicate some way, no matter where you go on the planet and presumably in the universe. We all have something that we generally refer to as art. And so there is this level that's just what it means to be a human. And that doesn't really shape us as much as the levels below that. So I want to keep thinking about a capital C culture. It starts with a big C, meaning the biggest picture you can imagine. And we joked around a little bit with this for the first 2 weeks, saying it would be much like describing America by saying NASCAR, McDonald's, hot dogs, apple pie, rock and roll. Really big themes that no matter where you live in the United States, you probably have encountered that part of US culture. Now I want to go a level down and get a little closer to what shapes us all individually. Sure, we lived with something called NASCAR or McDonald's. I drove by one once in a while, or maybe there was one in my city. I might have even worked at one, but it didn't shape my life as much as maybe somebody who lived in the big city or whose mom was a manager there, who had family in the business. This is where we get to the small c lowercase c culture, below big C culture, the area you live in. And again, we're still not super personal. We're going to go one level lower and call that social identity in a minute. But to get to that, you've got to think about all of these levels. The human level, every human does these things. The big cultural level, meaning an entire country, or in some cases, an entire group of people. You could think of Christianity being its own culture that transcends borders. So it's not just countries, but when we say culture, we're dealing with a certain way of thinking that a group of people tends to carry forward. And then below that, you can imagine if you grew up in on a dead-end road like I did, small town, 700 or 800 people in the town I lived in because it was very rural, and our nearest big town had less than 10,000 people living in it. So a small area. Because of that, I had very different experiences, and my neural makeup and my memories are very different than somebody who grew up in the middle of downtown Chicago. That's an extreme example, but you can imagine how things like cultural norms, the music that's normal, is it rap? Is it country? Is it rock and roll? Is it grunge? These sorts of things are more your small C culture, things that would be normal for you to hear in your high school. Figures of speech that the hundreds of people walking around you every day would pick up and use, but that if you took them up to another state to visit somebody and you use that figure of speech, they might scratch their head and not know what you're talking about. Small C culture. Now let's take that one level more and start talking today about what your first part 1 project, the paper you're going to submit, is going to look like. Social identity. We're now to the level of you. And to really get at that, you do want to follow the progression through to your the people you grew up with, your immediate close-knit family, the people you, maybe a small religious community, a few best friends, the people that shaped you the most. And it's worth thinking about things from US culture particularly, because we're so media saturated, where you saw images of people acting a certain way or dressing a certain way or their hair done a certain way, and you sort of followed these things. You felt compelled to use them to shape your identity. And of course, you weren't exactly like the actor or actress, and you might not have wore the outfit just like them, but you gained something from watching them perform it and you liked how it looked. You looked like it would feel good on you, a performance of identity. That's what we mean by social identity. Now, so far, this is vague and we've attached no terms, but this week, we're going to start looking at some specific terminology we can use to really get at how do we describe social identity using theories, using terms that we can cite from some of our authors, using concepts and ideas to help us really get at the root of who am I really? Because the social identity at the bottom actually has a lot to do with the small c culture and the big C culture. In the United States, we all grew up with some norms surrounding race, gender, socioeconomic status, how much money people have, that were just taken for granted. And when you grow up with it in your culture all the time, you hardly notice, as Beverly Tatum told us. So let's look at some more of the content this week. That's a brief primer on what I want you to be thinking about for this part 1 project. Who am I? And specifically using content pulled directly from the assigned readings. Now, I had mentioned this class is taking place in the United States. That doesn't mean everybody here has a primarily or first US identity, but it does mean everybody in the class has at least spent some time in the United States and had some experience with interacting with the culture, and that many of us did indeed grow up here. And I want to keep using that culture as a way to help us understand cultural norms in general, and more importantly, how you can take a look at some media in a culture and get some clues as to what you might be missing and what sort of norms might take place in that culture. So this is from a famous movie called Independence Day. I want to take a look at it and think about how Americans define themselves, how we practice our individualism, because we're a very individualistic culture, and yet we actually have some very binding qualities sort of built into that trope. So let's take a look at this scene.
Major. Arlen, sir.
Good morning.
Good morning.
In less than an hour, aircraft from here will join others from around the world. And you will be launching the largest aerial battle in the history of mankind. Mankind, that word should have new meaning for all of us today. We can't be consumed by our petty differences anymore. We will be united in our common interest. Perhaps it's fate that today is the 4th of July, and you will once again be fighting for our freedom. Not from tyranny, oppression, or persecution, but from annihilation. We're fighting for our right to live, to exist. And should we win the day, the 4th of July will no longer be known as an American holiday, but as the day when the world declared in one voice, we will not go quietly into the night. We will not vanish without a fight. We're going to live on. We're going to survive. Today, we celebrate our Independence Day.
Let's go. President, I just went already. Got your gear over here. Good luck. I got a jumpsuit for you and the rest of your gear squared away in this duffel. That's the choice of help.
Mr. President, I'd sure like to know what you're doing.
I'm a combat pilot, Will. I belong in the air.
Rear flank policy.
Hold on, Command. I want another shot at it. Sir, I strongly recommend you disengage.
Eagle 1. Fox 3.
Squadron leaders, fire at will, fire at will, fire at will.
We're going in. Squadron leaders, take point.
Eagle 6 at 7.
Eagle 5 at 3.
Eagle 1. Box 2.
Eagle got tone. Eagle 20. Box 2. Eagle 20. Box 2. It's jammed. It won't fire.
Damn it.
Do me a favor. Tell my children I love them very much. All right, you alien assholes. In the words of my generation, up yours!
Dad, what's he doing?
Come on, things, come on.
Good luck, buddy.
Oh, boys! I'm back!
And of course, if you've seen the actual film, you know that this actually is the victorious scene. There's a ton packed into here. This film is actually called Independence Day, which is a shout out to American culture. But we spoke a little bit about American culture these first 2 weeks and how it's defined by something we often call exceptionalism, this belief that America is the greatest. And we seldom really finish the sentence. We just know we're the greatest. And you're seeing some of that in this scene. You're seeing a group of people that the president has to get riled up and pumped up and ready to go. And he's doing it by appealing to their sense of Americanism, their US identity, the things that drive America. So he's not saying we've got to fight for our the future in 500 years or the production of technology to continue or to keep philosophy alive. Oh no. He's saying independence strategically because that's something that Americans have as this deep idea connected to individualism. We view independence as leave me alone. And you also get some examples of that in here. Individuality or individualism, and then it's mere reflection, which is our country doesn't fall apart just because we are very focused on individual goals and ideas and making our own way in life and being independent and living in single family homes and things like that. We do have this cohesive collective bond beneath it. It just doesn't reflect in the same way as it does in what are considered traditionally collectivist cultures. But when we're needed, we show up. When the United States is under attack, that patriotism compels us all to come together under the banner of what you would call big C culture. We all are Americans after all, don't forget. So we might all have our individual things. Also, it's worth thinking, we'll talk a little more about how much we claim to treat everybody the same and how much that actually happens in reality and how that actually is an example of a cultural norm in coming weeks. But you see an example here of how the United States tends to present itself as the rules are the same for everybody country. But in reality, in practice, that's not necessarily the case. So you see a president who's normally considered in the executive branch, the presidential branch rather, but like dressed in a suit. He's not out there doing the hard work. He's getting the stuff behind the scenes done, and he's willing to take that off, get in a fighter, and risk it all to join his fellow man to fight. And you see that the hero of this movie in the scene is actually somebody that throughout the movie is a nobody who's struggling with running from the government at times and down on his luck. In the United States, the American dream, as we'll talk about shortly, whether it's true or not, it does say anybody can be the hero. Anybody can do it. You just got to be willing to step up when the moment arises. So just some quick examples of how small snippets of US cultural, what we would call artifacts, things that can show us a reflection of ourselves, can give us an idea of how a culture operates below the level. All right, so let's I mentioned this already, but I want to say it again. Make sure you're taking notes as you do the readings because they can count as your quiz grades. If something happens on a quiz and you don't get the grade you want, you can send me your reading notes and I'll replace them. We're already talking about our projects. I believe it's week 5, not week 6. So make sure you double check. This says week 5. And so I want to think a little bit about neurology as a place to start today. And of course, most of us aren't neurologists, so we're not going to go super deep into neurology. But I want to talk about one neurotransmitter particularly. As I mentioned, I study drug culture and addiction a lot as my out of college job, if you will. I write about it. And dopamine's a really misunderstood chemical. We tend to think of it as associated with pleasure. The word dope actually comes from a shortening of dopamine because the original understanding was that was what was happening when dopamine shows up. It is literally just a pleasure chemical. Now, it turns out that's not quite correct. It's more involved in compelling us to do something, in motivation. Dopamine is what you see spike in somebody when they get ready to move, and it coordinates the movements of millions of neurons in muscle fibers and tendons and everything else to do very intricate movements that take a lot of brain power happening very quickly. So we've got lots of neurotransmitters, but it's worth pointing out that dopamine shows up when something happens that makes us say, I need to pay attention to this. So why are we talking about this? Because at the heart of who we are as humans, as we sink back down from that big C culture, capital C, to a small c where we lived, and then our social identity, is where we start to realize the reactions I have to things are different than the reactions somebody else has. There are words and phrases somebody can say to a friend of mine that will tick them off like that. And they could say the same thing to me, and it doesn't even get me off my square at all. It might not even bother me. There are things that I can experience in the world. I do not like violence at all. So when I encounter it, it sort of puts me off my square and knocks me out of my zone for a few days. It really gets in my head because of some trauma I've had from the past. And I can be with people who experience the exact same thing and not only don't feel traumatized from it, but a lot of people actually enjoy it and want to engage in it, both vicariously and in real time. Get close, watch, get a good view so you can live through it later and tell the story over beers, right? Just some examples of how in some of us, dopamine is firing in those moments to say, oh, go do one thing. And in some of us, it's firing to say, go the other way. It's activating circuits that say, get out. And the difference between different people, whether we're talking cultural differences, social identity differences, just differences because of trauma, always comes down to what we've been through in the past and how our genetics programmed our brain initially. And there's not much room for anything else. Even if you're someone who believes in something like a soul, it's still operating on the same basic mechanisms that are our brain. So I want to keep that in mind, that as we're talking about ways to understand culture, we're not just talking about faraway theories that are in books, but we can literally think about these things as ways to describe what happens when I go, or when I smile, oh, that felt good, or when I experience something that is pleasant or surprising, or I feel compelled to act. Now let's tie this into some of the content you read this week. I mentioned I'm not going to talk about a ton, but I'll get into a little. We're going to bring up the iceberg quite a bit, but I expect that when you're writing your discussion post and your projects, part 1, 2, and 3, you're really using theories like this to explain what you want to talk about and connect it to your life. So it's worth thinking about some US cultural norms that would be above the iceberg, meaning you're in France or you're in Switzerland and you want to visit the United States. You're going to do some Google searching and you're going to call a couple friends and you're going to say, tell me about it. Tell me how they treat the law. Tell me how they treat women. Tell me how they treat gay people. And you're going to get an above the iceberg description, right? And it's going to be super simple. And it'll probably align with mostly like a high-minded view of ourselves, considering we're America's the greatest for what nation? You'll get something like, how do we treat gay people? Well, we had some issues in the past, but we've actually passed a lot of laws that have given them rights, and we're trying to make amends. That's what you might find on the internet. Yes, there's still a problem, but it's not like that anymore. Now, underneath the iceberg, when you get here and you find yourself in conversations with people, you are going to hear clues that those homophobic, transphobic, LGBTQIA phobic concepts, beliefs, ideas that the person told you they're not in America anymore. What are you talking about? We've jettisoned those. There's a few problems, but most people aren't like that. You'll realize they're still there. They're just not as obvious, and they're definitely not socially sanctioned. So they're policed in a different way, and they're only spoken in certain group settings. Think about equality of under the law. You will see a blindfolded Lady Liberty holding a scale with justice on both sides, as if to say it matters not how much money you have, the color of your skin, the religion you practice. Everyone will be treated equal under the law. And you're going to come here thinking that's great news, because in my country, it's not like that. I'm going to go to a safer place. And then you're going to get here and realize 95% of cases end in plea deals with no trial, because a lot of people can't afford to bond out of jail. But if they just plead guilty, they can get it over with. But if you got a load of money, you can literally walk the streets with 100 felonies and small enough bonds that it doesn't even bother you that much. You can get different legal representation. You can file all sorts of paperwork and attempts to overthrow or change different things that normal people without attorneys don't have the ability to just keep chucking money at things like that. But this isn't what you're going to hear when you're asking somebody from outside the US, what's the US like? So this iceberg is a valuable way for you to take a theory from our reading, describe it using the reading, not using my lecture. Make sure you're doing the readings and showing you're doing the readings. Describe it and then explain something about your social identity or your small c cultural identity or your big C cultural identity and how it operates using this framework. And you're on the right track. That's what this whole class, the majority of the work is about. So let's do this one more time with Bobby Harrow's, as we read about his cycle of socialization. He tells us we're born into the world, we're a blank slate, and then the people around us get to work wiring up those neurons, as I was just describing, in different ways by treating us a certain way, by offering us affection, not enough, too much, the perfect amount, based on what we eat, whether our diet is sufficient, how much stress we experience in the first few months of our life, who our parents tell us God is through the first 10, 15 years of our life, how we learn to believe other people like us experience life, whether they're evil or they don't agree with us and they have different beliefs. And we don't question any of it, says Harrow. How could we? We're born a blank slate and we're programmed up by people who were biologically wired to just believe. We take everything they say at face value for the most part. But then something weird happens, says Harrow. We have this first socialization and we end up out in institutional and cultural spaces, this yellow circle, and suddenly we're encountered with some pushback. We're encountered by people who say, what did you just say? And then you tell the joke again that you've told to your parents 5 times and they've laughed every time. It's even old and boring. They've never corrected you or acted like you shouldn't tell that joke. And you tell the joke again and somebody says, that's really racist. What is wrong with you? What? You're disciplined in public in real time. You encounter somebody from a public space or an institutional space and you suddenly realize, wait, have I been doing something that on second thought I didn't know I shouldn't be doing? Or have I not been doing something that maybe I should be doing? I noticed the song just started and everybody around me stood up. Is it the national anthem? And Harrow is saying to go to circle 3, this is a 3-part process. It's at this moment we have a decision to make. We can either say, I want to fit in better. I think I'm going to try to change this and not tell racist jokes anymore. Or I think I'm going to stand up when the national anthem's on. Or we can say, no, I don't care about those institutional requirements or norms. Screw those institutions. I value what I was taught originally more. And as humans, we're actually prone to stick with it, our normal original programming, which is why it's so hard for society to move on and progress on some issues very fast. But it is possible, according to Harrow, to use this to map the progression of our identities. Almost all of us at this point in our life have multiple things that we have at one point in our adult life said, wait a second, is that not true? And we've literally changed our mind and then changed our behavior because of that. We are trained at home, cycle 1. We encounter something in the world that makes us question what we believed all along. And then we have a decision to make. Do we keep doing what we were doing all along, or do we try a new way and try to figure out where we were wrong and how we can change in the future to be more correct? All right, Gary Weaver is an author who talked about the fact that in the United States, along with we're the best country ever, I'm a patriot, and that's it. And we seldom complete the sentence by saying we're the best country ever at. We're not so good at child mortality and health care and taking care of old people and living long and feeding ourselves healthy and not telling ourselves lies on the media so we buy products that don't work. But we are good at a lot of stuff. As we found out, we don't really get intricate like that. We just say best country ever. And one of those best country ever statements is that we're a melting pot. You know, people come here and they just melt in, and the culture is like a mix of all the different cultures that have shown up in the past. And what Weaver says is we would do a lot better to pay attention to how the world really works and notice that you don't go to restaurants that have all kinds of foods unless it's a buffet, which is actually a very American restaurant. But even at a buffet, you'll notice the Italian section, the Mexican food section, depending on where you're at, the dessert section, the different ethnic sections separated depending on how big the buffet is. That's more what we should think of. It's more of a salad bowl where there's different chunks that are very close together, and you could actually think of like how you might be able to look at a handful of different pieces of culture very close, but they're not blended or melted. They're literally still separate. So the restaurant's a good example. Other cultural events are a good example, that it's not uncommon at all to see Latina events where it doesn't mean there's not white folks or black folks there, but it's geared towards that group. And you tend to see that group participating in the cultural norm. That's more what we should think of the United States as different cultural identities accessible to everybody, yet sort of walled off in some way nonetheless. One more good example of that is get in your car and turn on the radio if you still have one that actually works, and just hit seek and flip through the channels, and you'll notice cultural salad. You'll notice R&B hip hop on one station, then you'll notice rock and roll or classic rock on another, and seldom do the two interact. And then you'll notice country music on another, and then you'll notice Spanish music on another, and they don't mix together. In fact, you would be kind of thrown off if you noticed some cultures were literally bleeding into others that quick. It wouldn't feel right in the United States. So another metaphor worth considering using in your reflection journals and discussions. Also, another interesting thing to put on our list of stamped perfect without much thought. How does religion play out in the US? We don't have a national religion, whereas a lot of other countries do, and you read about this a little this week. Be thinking about how those countries that have a national religion, technically, it's written down in their founding documents, says this is what our national religion is. Think about how they practice their religiosity and how they treat the government when it maybe tries to connect religion and politics. And then think about the United States, where there deliberately is a separation of church and state, and we have no official state religion, and yet we have under the surface and possibly above the iceberg tip, if you asked Joe Schmo on the street, what's the national religion? They would probably say it's a Christian country. Technically, it's not. And if you looked it up online from afar, you would see the tip of the iceberg that said no official Christianity, no official religion of the state. And technically, it's banned from being a religion. They've separated church and state. And yet our laws throughout most of our history have literally been founded, endorsed, and often written by members of the church off biblical tenets. That's why a large part of why women weren't considered right holders in the original Constitution. They weren't even mentioned. Couldn't own property, couldn't vote. If you wanted any say whatsoever, you better find a man to marry, is what the original founders thought. That's not a natural belief to just hold on to hardcore as we start to progress, but it was backed up in their minds by many religious tenets. So again, trying to get now to what is our social identity. We've been playing with how did I start out programmed up one way? Why was it that I was taught what I was taught based on my big culture, my local culture, and my parents specifically? Why did I learn things that other people didn't learn, that I was right about and they were wrong about, or that they were right about and I was wrong about? And now we want to think about, who are you? In the United States, how do you usually identify yourself? In some countries that are more collectivist, meaning they define themselves more by their connections to others, you will hear, I am Ben Boyce, son of Steve and Diane. In the United States, we don't define ourselves so much as by who we are, so much as by what we do, because we are a very driven culture. Our drive to achieve, to use some of our first language that I want woven into your assignments, we won't read this until next week, but drive to achieve outweighs our push for quality of life. Although we have a lot of both, but those tend to be in a culture pulled back and forth. So you can think of drive to achieve. I want to work all day and get my money and make sure I got tons put away and have a nice house I can hang out in, versus quality of life. I just want to lay back and chill and not have a worry in the world. The United States tends to be pushed towards drive to achieve. Where do our individualistic traits come from? You got a good example of this week with our history in the United States. We were individualist. We showed up on a continent that was already occupied with different ideas and plans about staking off huge areas of land and growing huge crops and trying to make our way across to the West. And if we had to, killing people on the way. That's a very individualistic attitude. We weren't living in cities where if something went wrong, we could go to the hospital. We were on farms in the middle of nowhere. So individualism, it runs in the blood of this country. Same with getting down to business so fast. We are very focused on drive to achieve, on give me that money. It's a we are like the central hub of capitalism in the United States, for better or for worse, or maybe for both. And again, this is woven into our real everyday interactions. This isn't just theory. We're talking about, you pull up to a stoplight and there's a homeless person next to you. What are some of the reasons that somebody in the car with you might say, give them some money or don't give them some money? And it's not hard to imagine the stories or ideas or tropes, stereotypes we've heard over and over, that they make a bunch of money, they don't even need to work, they make more than you, or why don't they go get a job? They're just standing here because nobody will make them because they just keep getting handouts. Things that take the focus off of us and let us continue to say greatest country ever, even as we're looking at people without homes. Another point we're thinking about, in individualistic cultures, we'll find terms that everybody gets to have their own definition of. And in the United States, we've got lots of examples. What does patriotism mean, right? Well, it means different things to different people. In an odd example, the exact same thing can be patriotism in one person's eyes and traitor in another person's eyes. Think of what God means and how everybody, even people that have the same religion, if you really press them to describe God, are going to describe that idea very different. All right, so let's dive into Beverly Tatum real briefly. And again, I want to make sure you're reading it. But as an example, think about how you would draw yourself on paper. If we right now just took the time, and if you are with your notes, feel free to doodle yourself. And I really want you to draw you. So as you're thinking, like, how would I draw me? How am I going to differentiate me? What would you do? It can be a stick person. It doesn't need to be a perfect portrait, but what might you draw? Let's see if I can use my whiteboard. Okay, that's terrible, right? But you can see that even in drawing myself, and this is hopefully worse than all of yours even, so you know I was serious when I said you can draw anything you want. I've added some tattoos, that's what these are, because I have tattoos, and I feel like that's an example that gives people an example of who I am. I actually added something that I do, my ATV, and I could have kept going here. I studied drugs, so I might have drawn, like a jar of drugs in the corner or something, or some paper with me writing a document or something. But the more I tried to draw or think about drawing who I am, the more I found myself thinking of things that differentiate me from other people. And again, this is worth thinking about when you're moving towards the social identity project. That's what we're looking for. We're trying to get at, number one, what is it about me that might be different than the stereotype of the US American? What Audre Lorde called the mythical norm that actually doesn't exist, but this perfect average of what an American should be that everybody in some way feels compelled or pressured to be, and yet nobody fully lives up to. Those are the things that stand out, things that are different. And it doesn't necessarily mean they don't line up with being American. It means you notice them as defining you as different than other people. And if you thought about 10 years ago, you would immediately notice Bobby Harrow's cycle of socialization. You've changed. What you were 10 years ago is probably a far cry from what you are today. And that's not just, again, metaphor, boots on the ground, dopamine rates change. You get some treatment for some trauma, and pathways in your brain that used to fire with some stimuli no longer fire the same way, or maybe they're connected to other areas. You learn something new, or you experience some new thing that literally changes who you are. Between the age of 15 and 25, where some of you are still at, literally half of the connections in your brain prune off and die because they're not needed anymore. Instead, you find the ones that seem to work best for you, and you sort of lock in who you are, and it's no longer fun to play with Legos. It doesn't even sound inviting at all. I used to do it all the time as a kid. Those pathways to pleasure literally change through experience. So as Tatum's saying, this is all great, but this is social identity, which means we've got to do what we were doing earlier and back out and talk about our small c culture and our big C culture, because we don't get to decide how to see ourselves as much as we would like that. No, we are in a culture where we are treated certain ways by people based on what they see in us, and that impacts us. She even says that we see others as the mirrors in which we see ourselves. So I wear a certain shirt and I think I'm rocking this new outfit, and I go out in public and I immediately start to get these oh my gosh, look at his shirt. Everything changes in that instant. It's really hard to not let that impact you, because as humans, that really is how we define our success in social situations, by others. Now, of course, in the United States, Tatum's going to make this point that, yes, it's our past, as I've shared in the past. Here's some of my fun. Oh, I need to share my screen again. So here's some of the things that define me from the past. And I've shared some of this with y'all already. I spent some time in prison 20 years ago now. That's something that always still informs who I am. And as I've also shared, I teach inside prisons now. I teach college classes. I do some different work with prison poetry, a magazine called Captured Words, Free Thoughts. Feel free to look it up if you're still listening and falling asleep. And then, of course, I ride ATVs, and I've had some hella cool accidents up there that I luckily wasn't hurt on. So I had some footage of one that are moments in my life, snapshots that define me, that once again set me apart from other people and help me explain who I am. But as Tatum's saying, we've got to think about the culture. And she uses these great metaphors that, yes, we have a norm. If I just said, I talked to a person today, and you drew a stock character, since I didn't say they were old, you probably came up with somebody 18 to 24. I didn't say it was a kid. Since I didn't say they were black, in your mind's eye, they were probably white, because the majority of the people in the US still are today. Since I didn't say they were rich or poor, you probably assume they're middle class. They're somewhere in the middle. And all of this happens automatically, because when somebody's telling you a story, you have to put a person in the role to make sense of the story. I went to the store and bumped into this person, and as I'm walking down the aisle with them next to me, your mind is playing this in its mind's eye as I'm saying it. So Tatum's going to tell us that there are different aspects of identity that mark us as different and are designed to make us feel inferior. And I want to emphasize just a few quick things with Tatum, and then I'll get out of here, because these monologue lectures and asynchronous classes, I get it, they're hard to listen through. It's too long. She's number one saying there is a smog we live in. There is a airport runway belt that is always moving. And if you think you're standing still, or if you think breathing in smog all day, every day isn't going to impact you, if you think standing on a moving walkway isn't going to move you towards the racism that the culture seems just built to reinforce unless somebody's fighting against it, then you're certain to not notice it. And you're going to feel attacked when somebody points out that it's there. But you would, if you're in a culture like that, literally have to push back against it to avoid being a product of it. So that's number one. Number two, she's giving us a great way to understand that it doesn't require bad people. Any group of people that move to an area are going to build institutions and structures and businesses that benefit their way of life. That's not because they're bad people, it's because they're people. So the example I like to use of this is if a whole bunch of us are vegetarians, we move to an area and we build some houses and some infrastructure and we realize we need some food, y'all. So we build a vegetarian restaurant. Maybe they sell veggie burgers. And then more vegetarians move in, only vegetarians. This is great. So we build another restaurant. Of course, it's not going to serve meat, not because we're bad people. That'd be weird. Just because no one's going to buy it. We're not going to go out of our way to build a system that doesn't benefit us. Why would we do that? We're humans. We have a reason for building the building. We want it to make food for us, and we don't eat that food. So why would we put that food there? All normal, no bad people required. Now people like me come to town that eat meat, and maybe we can't eat some of the vegetarian foods they have. Or even if we just are used to eating meat, the point is we're immediately going to feel kind of out of place, right? We're going to have to adapt. We're going to have to figure out, how do we navigate this new space? Because it's got some barriers that the old space I'm used to didn't have. And again, no bad people required. So a few more things from Tatum. She points out that the identities we tend to notice are subordinate identities, and everybody has subordinate identities, meaning things that we just don't feel like we're living up to based on the pressure we receive from society. And of course, she's not defending that pressure. She's trying to blow it apart as best she can as a feminist. But to do that, she's trying to really detail how it works. And it works just by making us feel like we need to perform a certain way. We need to act a certain way. So we tend to notice the things that stand out because we're disciplined. So my criminal identity is something I define myself by too, because it's something that is like a sore thumb. I try to get into a prison to teach, and sometimes they got to run me through extra tests and make sure I'm safe. It gets in the way of navigating institutional power. Whereas a lot of things, my white skin, I hadn't even thought about. I'm just a guy. And even as a guy, just feels like it's the way it is. It's because I don't think people are saying you can't come here because you're a man. I don't encounter that. And again, the dominant group gets to choose the rules, not because the dominant group is assholes, but because the dominant group is just building a system to benefit themselves. What other system could they build? And of course, sometimes it turns into that. Our system's so huge now that it's hard to argue that there aren't people deliberately trying to make policies to make other people's lives harder. But that's not actually the stated theme, desire of the system. The system claims to be here and believes itself to be here to make lives easier. So the question again is, whose lives? Well, the dominant groups. Last thing worth pointing out, intersectionality, a term that's frequently misunderstood. It literally means the way that different identities pull on you in different ways when you're in public, when you're in a space like an institution, when you're on the phone with somebody from an institution, when you're at your job. You got to add time to this equation, because here's what's interesting about intersectionality, and I want you to chew on this for your discussion board. This is the last thing I'll leave you with this week. It can work, different identities can work different in different situations. And I mean like some of the most unexpected ways. So take my criminal record. I have multiple felonies. They're old, but the second I get pulled over by the police, guess what shows up on their computer? Police warning hazard, arrested with a weapon at some point in the past, something like that. They get an automatic warning when they run my license plate, which means when they walk up to the car, they're treating me differently, and I am given a little bit less benefit of the doubt. They're a little bit more suspicious when they look at me, meaning that identity pulls on me a certain way. Not when I'm driving down the road. I was same as everybody else. But the second I'm pulled over and power from an institution is interacting, things change. Now let's flip this, because that's one that you would find hard to believe can be positive, but it can be a dominant identity too. So the words I want you to be thinking from Tatum: dominant identities, subordinate identities. Subordinate, when I get pulled over, I have a criminal record. Dominant, I'm in a prison on the first day of a class trying to convince a group of 20 felons that they can trust me and we can build some rapport and have a class. Maybe I've got something to teach them. I don't have to jump through some of the proofs that other teachers come in who look like squares sometimes have to jump through. That actually becomes a dominant identity in that institutional space, because power pulls on me in a different way. So as you're thinking about dominant, subordinate identities for your discussion posts, chew on that last part and work to incorporate that very idea called intersectionality by Kim Crenshaw. We didn't read her article, but that's who invented that term, into your discussion post. And with that, I'll see you next week. Make sure you are hitting the readings hard in your assignments when you turn stuff in. Just final reminder, that's where your points come from. Not just from the lectures, which will help, but from showing you've read and engaged with the readings. Have a good week.